Hi everybody, on here coming to you with part 2 of the 3-part series, The Breakdown of Humanity. And yesterday is when I did the first part, but in the first part we covered a lot of ground. So if you missed that, go back, take a look at it, and see what's there. And we delved into some pretty big aspects of things that were going on, including putting out a call to liberals, because they are going to play such a big role in the new narratives that are coming through. And I actually got into how narratives are done and about how I look for patterns when I'm looking at things that are happening in the world and understanding the code patterns and what we need to learn and what we need to get from them, because they're getting ready to put in the climate crisis mode of things, and that is going to weigh very heavily in then. So if you haven't seen that part yet, you might want to go back and check that out. And we are focusing today on part 2, and I know I have a lot of information to get through, as always, right? People say as always, and I go, well, I want them shorter, but then again, I really like everything that you cover, so, maybe you can give me some feedback and see what you like, and I'm going to keep working on this and keep trying to refine it and keep trying to bring it together in ways that are more cohesive, because I understand the timepiece and things, but at least, I'm only putting out these aspects like once a month, really, as opposed to you getting a 2-hour video every couple of days. So, I do see that the overall time is maybe not as much as some of the other ones that we see out there. But in this segment, we are really going to be focusing on what I call an experiment in action. So this is where the whole narrative stuff starts to take the next level. It starts to go to the next space. And this is where people who are creating these narratives actually start going beyond hypocrisy. It's not just hypocrisy, it becomes absurdity, because they are at a point where they think they are invincible. They think that they can get away with anything. The absurdities are now a way of really mocking people, making fun of them. And I talked about that last month in the other series that I did, which you can check out as well. And and that dynamic, that's really what the absurdities are about. It's like, well, let's see how far we can push the limits. Let's see how crazy it is. And that, sadly enough, is also what drives us into these communist, very highly structured, controlled societies, which are not in alignment with our spirit. They're not in alignment with the soul self, because the soul self is rooted in freedom. And so when you get all of these highly structured things and you start coming up with these absurd rules and regulations that, really have no place, I mean, ultimately we need to teach people how to move into that responsibility. We need to encourage, how some of that personal accountability, and we can do that without heavy regulations. Here again, I'm talking a lot more about balance, because balance is going to be a key piece as we come into 2022. And it's going to be very, very critical for us to start coming out of these polarities and saying, it's got to be this way or this way, and to get out of some of these extremes and start working together, start looking at the actual facts, start, joining our pieces of information together. Because I think we always have so much to learn from the polarity energy in there. And ultimately, the core principles that we want are the same. We've just got to find more reasonable ways to approach things in our world that includes wisdom and truth. And unfortunately, so many of the things that people try to implement in our world are based in agendas, and they're not based in truth. And this is a really hard piece for people to grasp. It's a really hard piece for people to accept and see, because they say, but we live in America. We're not a communist country. We're not a socialist country. But the reality of it is that we're becoming that. We may not be 100% there, but we've got one foot in the door. whether we like it, whether we want to see it, whether we want to admit it, and it's coming in from the people who are speaking one language and talking and doing something else completely. And the thing is that most people, they don't have the time or the energy to just go out and research all these things, so they rely on the media and they rely on people that are doing podcasts and the news outlets and sources and things like that, which have just really gotten through a lot of corruption. And we're seeing that. We're seeing the truth surface. We're seeing them caught in their lies along the way. But we've got to hold compassion with each other, and we've got to stop coming into division. So in this particular video, on this segment, part 2 of this series, The Breaking Down of Humanity, this whole series is about helping us understand how we're being broken down. It's about helping us see the ways that we're being destroyed as a culture and a society here in America, that right under our faces. And it's been going on for decades. And it's about facing some of the things that we don't like to acknowledge, that we don't like to see, and that we can't just keep ignoring. Because now what we have going on in society is we have these massive levels of literally brainwashing going on. and it's not just all one side. There's things happening from both sides of things. And we've got to learn how to keep our head clear in this. So absurdities is the next big piece. And I start with this because the absurdities almost serve as triggers. Again, they're a mocking, they're a teasing. So they trigger all of these aspects that can be connected to self-worth, that can be connected to how we feel about each other, that can just actually cause us to turn away and say, I'm not even going to look at anything. And then that's a danger zone, because that's where things get pushed through that we don't even see. And so, that's a big thing. But it's in these absurdities, they continue to trigger this irritation. They continue to trigger a stuff that leads into the bigger aspects of how these brainwashing techniques work as a bigger society, a bigger culture. And they work through 2 key areas, really, creating division and hate. And so as we become divided, we hate more. As we hate more, we become more divided. And this is like a never-ending which came first, the chicken or the egg cycle type of thing. And it just keeps feeding off of each other. It keeps perpetuating, and that eventually then does go up and into violence of things. So I want to kind of jump right in here, and one of the first big absurdities that we have is something that many people have been fighting over for at least the last year, right? Which is mask. And now they're telling us, not only do you have to wear a mask, it started off like, okay, you've got to wear a mask when you're out in public spaces where you can't distance, and, you're going to be close to people, and you're in crowds and things like that. Then it went to, you have to wear, mask pretty much everywhere, even if you can distance. And then it went to, you've got to wear mask even if you're outside or in your home, or, and it just got getting more and more absurd. And then it was like, now you got to wear 2 masks. Then maybe you should wear 3 masks. And, and you see the absurdity of this. And now they're saying, well, you may never get out of mask. But we need to understand why they're saying this. We need to look at the context of this. And this is where people, they get so honed in and so focused on an issue or a particular piece of something, and they're not really understanding the language that's being spoken this. And the reason that they're saying this is that they're saying, well, we may never get out of the mask because now there might be 2 viruses, or there might be 3 viruses coming around, or whatever, however many viruses. It doesn't really matter. But the reality of it is throughout time, all of time, we've constantly had these viruses. And many of these viruses are not even originating naturally. That's the thing. When you start to really look at the way viruses form, and you start to delve in that whole arena, you realize that most of the stuff just doesn't come in naturally. Most of this stuff has been tied to somebody wanting power or somebody wanting something in the world and getting greedy and things like this. And so I will talk about that in regards to the codes, because a virus in codes is connected to materialism. It is about suffocating the spirit. It is about closing down on the soul and divine presence or divine energy and walking into a materialistic mindset, a greed mindset, a jealousy mindset, a mindset that interrupts positive relationships and connections for us. And so this creates a internal struggle of family. So whether you're talking that family unit being the human race, a literal family unit, or a community. And so a virus is not just about a physical thing. That's the piece that I love about the codes. It's not just a physical thing. It is about opening that door up to understanding that this is really about separation. The energetic piece of this is about separating, dividing partnerships, getting people to argue, getting people to be in this competition with one another. And then masks, when we look at the codes of masks, are really about how power is being used. And if power is used positively, then it can, get us through a serious issue. So, but the key is that a lot of times masks are not used where there's a true issue. They're being used in construction with a misuse of power. And when it's done with a misuse of power, it then becomes an aspect of creating turbulence. So a mask is not just about bringing peace. It can bring peace for some people, but it creates a lot of turbulence. It creates a lot of upheaval. It is about destroying security and the self and the ability to provide for oneself. It's about removing things. It's about loss in many ways. So the masks are very different things. And now, of course, we have to look at it in the context of everything that's going on. Now, when we combine mask with the virus, in other words, wearing a mask in society because there's an alleged virus out there, or a virus that is dangerous enough to warrant that. And of course, when you look at everything and you look at the facts, including the boxes and everything else, it tells you it's not going to protect you from this. But that's a whole other thing. We don't need to go down that road, okay? But that is very different than, say, wearing a Mardi Gras mask. That energy code pattern would be totally different from masks as they combine with a virus. And when we combine the code energies of mask and virus, what we find is competition. Competition that is specifically designed to isolate those people who are standing with God. And I find that very interesting, because isn't that really a lot of what's unfolded in our society over the last year or so, that this has been about isolating out those people who will or will not conform. It's about isolating off and excluding and trying to, in many ways, remove from society those people who do not want to partake in wearing a mask. And these are much, much bigger dangers in the world when we start to do this, because this is literally right in front of our faces, that it's an attempt to remove God from society. And let's take a look at this, because all of this requires us to use discernment. Certainly if there was something that was affecting more than 1% of the population, if there was, if there was something that it didn't, create more issues for people in regards to all the other violence and things like that go on and that tie in and have to be weighed out. We have to really look at who's involved, who's playing in this. And we start looking at all the people that are promoting this aspect are standing in this corruption, are standing in this materialism, are putting forth and working from Marxist ideals, for example, or socialist ideals, or some of these other ideals which are about suffocating freedom, then we start to unfold more and more layers. And when we start to look at context and we start to get into discernment and we really start to understand what the virus is about, we understand that we really have two viruses that are being referred to and talked about. So you have, the virus, a true virus, regardless of which one you're talking about, is connected to corruption. It's connected to hate. It's actually connected to the CCP. And those are just the first level or round of things that try to be stimulated, is this hate and this division. And the second round of it all, it's about creating helplessness and fear and really magnifying that, because that's where they can start to get control. That's where they really start to take bigger command of things, which is why we've really got to be careful when they start talking about there's a second round coming, there's a third round coming, things like that. And so when you have these two different components of a virus, you have the one virus, which is all of the corruption, and then you have the other virus, which is considered to be those people who are fighting for freedom, supporting freedom, the nonconformist in there. And so when you hear Fauci, for example, or you hear some of the other people that are in these controlling agendas and connected to these controlling pieces of wanting to have more control and power and greed in their life, the Bill Gates and things like that, when they talk about the virus, they're referring to those people who are standing up for the rights, those people who are supporting freedom. It has nothing to do with caring about anybody's health, because you see, the people who speak the truth, the people who are standing up for the freedom, are dangerous to them. They're dangerous to the people who want to control everything, who want to bring in these communist structures into our society, who want to have absolute 100% control over your life. The people who believe in God are dangerous to them because they hold hope, they hold faith, they create keeping people in a positive mindset, and that's destructive to their agendas. And then on the other side, you've got these people who are creating the corruption are the virus in there. And so the people who are really trying to look out for people, who really care about their well-being, okay, when they're talking about the virus, they're referring to these elite people trying to control things. They're referring to these people who are putting forth these agendas. So you see, the same word is being used, but they have really very different meanings and very different contexts. And of course, viruses do originate oftentimes. The reason our body becomes susceptible to them is because of these fear, because of the hate, because of these, some people would call them low energy vibrations, but because of these very dense mindsets that are there. And so just like abuse, just like brainwashing, just like these other things, the body doesn't have the resistance to fight it off when we're in these dense energy mindsets in there. So, even Fauci said that, that masks don't work. And we're going to start off with that clip, and then I'm going to move into the absurd pieces of things, because we need to realize, again, these absurd stories are the ones that are extremists. They're the ones that are taking things too far. These are what, in these absurdities, are oftentimes where the foundations of these communist structures are starting, because these types of controls are not based on any fact or reason or common sense or any of those types of pieces. They're based in sheer absurdity, mocking, and so on and so forth. So let me bring up actually these little things, and we will move on over to our dear Mr. Fauci. dear Mr. Fauci here. Okay. And let's just start off with this clip and then we'll go from there, because again, in their own words, and yes, things can shift and change along the way, but he makes it very, very clear that the masks are not doing what people think. People think that the masks are protecting themselves, but they're not really doing that. They're when we get in the context, it's really about these other pieces of submission, of giving into the control, of being conditioned, of being brainwashed and things. Unintended consequences. Oh, you bet. Are we talking about those unintended consequences of how it affects the brain level, how it affects the oxygen levels, how it affects all of these other things? So absolutely, there are unintended consequences, because when people are putting those masks on, their intention isn't to do damage to themselves. Their intention is to be helping themselves and helping others. But when you're damaging yourself, you're not helping yourself and you're not helping others. And again, we have to get back to the spiritual focus, because if we don't get back to the spiritual focus, we can't resolve the things that are happening physically in our world. Let's move on here to the next one, and let's start to move into these stories that are a little more absurd and things, and see how they just how they're mocking us, how invincible they think they are. We have this story now, not the bee. I want to remind people, because the bee is a satire. It's a satire site which creates, satired stories off of real things. Not the bee is actual real news. It's true news. And it was initiated by the same people in order to show this absurdity, in order to show the strange stories out there that will never be reported by the mainstream media, because they're things that they don't necessarily want you to see. They don't want you to know about these things that are really happening, because here again, they don't want you to get the truth. They don't want you to get the truth. It doesn't matter, really who we're talking about in mainstream media. They're really not wanting you to get those points. So, not the bee brings up this one. Michigan representative crashes car drunk with handgun and cup holder, resists arrest, then tells officers he'll call Governor Whitmore if they don't let him go. I mean, this is the extent of things. He just feels like he's invincible. Hey, I'm a public office. I'm, in politics. I'm connected to Governor Whitmore. You can't touch me, because the corrupt is in power, is basically what he's saying. Of course, this plays into some other narratives where they want to make the white guys seem like bad guys or things like that, and all of this stuff. But the fact of the matter is, if we come back to, as I was talking about in part one of this series, we can't make exceptions. If liberals are going to be true liberals, for example, they were founded on the fact that our politicians are not above the law. They're not above being held accountable like everybody else for the crimes that they commit. And this person, they had crashed their car while drunk with a handgun in the cup holder. And then they resist arrest. And then he tries to tell him, hey, Governor's, Whitmer's going to have your badge. And so let's take a look at this absurdity. Did you hear that? The officer asked for his ID, and he said, "I can't do that." So you can actually hear him saying that, that he's made that threat. He's made the threat against the officers for doing their job. Okay, so the next story of absurdity we have comes to, oh boy, great Chicago mayor, Lori Lightfoot. And she wants to, and this actually stimulated another parody video of a cop that has been going around asking for permission from LeBron James and things, and this is what was behind it, because she put this out where she wants to start requiring cops to get permission from a supervisor before chasing a suspect on foot. And she, she's actually seriously was considering this. And, the fact is this is only going to encourage more crime. That's what it's going to make sure violent crime in our city continues to sustain itself at third world country levels. And she wants to change this procedure, but you've got to realize if a police officer needs to go on a foot chase pursuit, that's something that's happening in the moment. By the time you make a phone call to a supervisor and you ask them, hey, can I have permission to go chase this guy on foot, right? That guy's long gone. They're blocks away. And so basically what you're doing is you're telling the criminals, hey, you can just, come in, do whatever you want, and you're not going to get caught. You're not going to get arrested for it because the police officer has to stop and get permission. So as long as you just take off and run, you're good because they can't pursue you. And that's an insane way. That's just kind of like saying just completely abolish the police, because it won't matter because they won't have time to go pursue anybody anyways in there. And it would be a huge change. And you got to think about, here again, she's putting her agendas, her motivations ahead of the well-being of people. If she really cared about the people in Chicago, she wouldn't be considering policies like that to make them more vulnerable. It's happening right in front of their faces and people aren't even seeing it. That's the crazy thing about this. Her opinion on this and her reasoning for this is no one should die as a result of a foot chase. Okay. She's okay with people being shot and criminals being shot every single day, but she's not okay with criminals being chased down. Think about that for a minute. It's absolute absurdity. It's absolute absurdity. A lot of foot chases don't result in death. They might result in some arrest, but they don't often, or all the time result in death. And this is the thing. It's not like somebody coming at you and charging a police officer. They're running away. So usually it requires the police officer to be able to run after them, to be able to catch them at some point where they can, again, be arrested, be held, be detained, things like that. And if they haven't created a crime, then there's no reason for them to go run away. So apparently she's going to announce these new policies soon. apparently some of the studies out there are saying, you know, if you look at death in that comes from foot chases, there aren't any. So, you know, that's, you know, unless somebody's turning around and firing at a police officer while they're running, which doesn't usually happen, the body doesn't often work that way. Foot chases are really not the cause of death. So it's just kind of this absurdity, this absolute absurdity. And I'll put links to these where you can read things completely. And then we have, you know, climate activists who they're not in any kind of a doomsday cult apparently, but they say that they see. But they've got they went and they marched to the White House with pink wheelbarrows and full of poop and chanting and singing that the end is near. So here they are, you know, claiming that there's all these issues for health, but then they go and they dump a bunch of manure in a highly public area that, you know, it is just crazy. And they were doing this chanting and this these aspects there, and it's just again, it's this absurdity of people not thinking about things. You know, they're creating this fear. Here again, this is a narrative that's creating fear, and climate change has a lot of fear around it that's going to be used to control a lot of people, or try to control a lot of people. And so they're sitting there saying, time is running out, time is running out. Well, you know, as I mentioned in part one, Jesse has heard so many times that the world was going to end. So many times we've been through that narrative in society, and when it's been connected to the climate change, it's never happened. When it's been connected to climate issues, and people want to do things, but again, it's a whole other realm, and so much of it is based in lies, and so much of it is based in false information and distorted information that's used to control people, is the bottom line. So that's where this all came in, and the funny thing is that there was words like love on the wheelbarrows and care, and here again, to do this, and you start thinking about the methane gas, and you start thinking about anybody that's walking in that area, what that can do for their lungs. So this is the hypocrisy, this is the absurdity when people start to get into a brainwashed space, and they're not looking at the bigger cascading pieces of what they're creating and what they're doing. And let's not forget about the person that's got to go then and clean that up and take care of that. You know, so this is really a strange piece, and you can go in and check out those videos if you want. Then we have the head of an elite Manhattan, New York private school admits on tape that they are anti-racist, that their teaching is demonizing white people for being born. And, you know, when you try to tell people these things, it's like, we don't believe that. We don't believe that. That can't be true. That can't be happening in our school systems. But it absolutely is. And we're at a point now where they're feeling so arrogant and so cocky about this that they're not hiding it, and they're using it to mock people. Like, look at what we can get away with. They're trying to tell people, look how stupid you are. You're going to just let us do this. And they're making fun of people, and this is a form of abuse. It's a form of bullying. And so this aspect, Paul Rossi is the teacher, and his employer is Grace Church High School. And this is a private school which is charges $57,000 a year for students to attend it. And the Foundation Against Racism and Intolerance released some videos showing that Grace Church High is knowingly promoting, well, they say anti-racist views, but it's not really anti-racist this way, but it's not anti-racist, it's actually racist views that demonize, and this is a lot of how the brainwashing works. They make the good seem bad and the bad seem good. And, you know, we need to kind of look at this. Paul Rossi wrote an expose, and here again, context. Remember what I said about context, on his former employer exposing the racist practices being implemented at the school under the guise of anti-racism. So they're saying, look, this is an anti-racist thing, but it's actually racism that they're promoting. And this is how these socialist, communist, Marxist philosophies work. They tell you it's one thing because they know if they tell you that enough times, your mind will start to accept it, and you start to believe what is good is actually bad, and what is bad is actually good, and it starts to reverse these things. So he brought it out. He exposed it. The name of this was "I Refuse to Stand By While My Students Are Being Indoctrinated." And this is, again, this is what happens in China schools. The indoctrination starts in the schools, and this is why we have to pay attention. And I already brought this up in last month's series of videos about what's happening in our school systems. And it's very dangerous, and it's very serious, and it's being done in ways that we don't even realize. And so apparently it stirred a lot of waves. It brought a lot of things out. And you know, in it, he makes the comment apparently that he is writing it because he's afraid of the consequences. And this is absolutely true. People are not looking at the consequences in a lot of these things, and that come from this, you know, questioning the authority of the critical race theorist, the anti-racist propagandist, because again, they're really promoting racism and division and not being against racism. And so, you know, he's had to be careful because he's got these consequences there. And, you know, of course, they're you know, there's all this stuff going on with it, but that's kind of the aspect of it. And the school asked Rossi to keep distance after the publication of his critique on things, and they initially said that the math teacher would not be disciplined for his piece, but he has since been told to keep his distance. So again, like, okay, we're not going to punish you this time as long as you comply and you control, you know, and you work with us. And so there's all these things in there, and I wanted to see, I thought, here we go. Here's the actual piece and the actual place where it was confessed that that's what they were doing. Right there, coming out of the mouth of the person in the school system. We are using language that makes them feel less than for nothing they are personally responsible for. In other words, we're condemning you for something that you have no control over and that you have no connection to and that you have no influence over. This is not how we get rid of racism, people. We don't get, as I've said it before, you don't get rid of wars by being at war. You don't get rid of racism by being racist. It's not going to work. We can't make that shift as long as we're choosing these paths. Moving on, we have Maxine Waters talking about the Derek Chauvin trial. And, they say here, how is this not inciting violence? How is it not jury intimidation? And this is the reality. Here again, you've got this authority figure who is in there. This is the very same person who called for riotings last year. This is the very same person that called to tell people to go and beat people who were not complying. This is how the CCP works. This is not how America works. This is how the CCP works. This is the tactics that they use. Go beat or kill, in some cases, the person that will not follow our rules and regulations and who will not give up God. This is the same pattern. This is exactly the same thing happening. And yet she condemned other people who didn't even actually call for violence and called them as inciting violence. But she directly outright does it. And here's where we see the arrogance and the absurdity. And here is where, again, this invincible aspect that comes through from people. And did you hear, she flat out said the right wing, the racist. So she's saying that everybody who is a conservative, a Republican on the right wing is a racist, which absolutely is not true. Just like everybody on the left wing does not automatically feel that we should have socialism. You have good players and you have bad players. And this is where I've said it before. We have to get out of these terms. We have to stop classifying people this way, and we have to start looking at them for the actions, for what they're doing. We have to stop allowing these people in authority positions to get away with whatever they want to get away with. There is no justification for calling violence on people. There is that is not okay. You should not be able to get away with that. And this is not how the soul process is going to work. This is not what the soul is going to align with. And this is not the soul's path to be doing these things. So these are part of the subtle brainwashing, the subtle programming that they slip in constantly to create this division and this hate. So this is like an aspect of kind of commanding people. This is, and we've actually had jurors come out and say that they felt threatened by this. They felt like they couldn't provide something because there were threats being made on their lives. And so this is again about controlling the narrative. We heard about that in CNN. You tell people, you lead them into what you want them to believe. And here's the thing, where she says we have to have this guilty and we're guilty verdict, and we're not going to go away until we get that. But what she doesn't tell you is that even though you get that, even though they get that verdict, that they're not going away, that the riots are going to continue with or without that verdict. So she flat out said it. We have to get more confrontational. This is what key people within these communist-style structures do. They incite violence. They tell people we have to get more violent. We have to get, and why is this? Again, because this is about control. So the more violence they can stimulate, the more hate they can stimulate, the more division they create. You know, again, that whole cycle goes back and forth, and then that continues to open the doors up to making people susceptible to being fully controlled. It's more and more and more steps in that direction. Now, one of the really absurd things that came out was this straw law in California. And the straw law, this is like unbelievable. This is also on Not the Bee, but I wanted to come in and pull it just so you could see it directly from the California legislative. Okay, this is off of legislature.legislature.ca.gov, and it comes into this. This is an actual bill, Assembly Bill number 1884, Chapter 576, and it was approved by the governor on September 20th, 2018. So this actually went into effect prior to the pandemic in there. And, you know, of course, I talked about the single-use plastic stuff before, and, you know, how that actually is going to create more damage for the environment than to create less damage for the environment. And straws became a big thing with a lot of the environmentalists, and understandably so, because of how they get into the oceans and the waterways and the different ways that it can damage life. So, you know, but of course we could go back to old straws, which were not plastic. There's a lot of different options we could do, you know, with things. And so anyways, this California retail food code that they have establishes uniform health and sanitation standards and so on and so forth. And the bill that went into action or was approved prohibits a full-service restaurant, as specified, from providing single-use plastic straws, as defined, to consumers unless requested by the consumer. The bill would specify, and the reason it's coming up now is because the bill has been actually approved. It's actually been approved. It's not just on the floor waiting to be approved. It's actually approved now. So the bill would specify that the first and second violations of these provisions would result in a notice of violation, and any subsequent violation would be an infraction punishable by a fine of $25 for each day the full-service restaurant is in violation, which doesn't sound much, but it could go up to $300, and the provisions would be enforced by the same officers authorized to enforce California Retail Food Code by creating a new crime and imposing additional enforcement duties on local health agencies. This bill would impose a state-mandated local program. And what this gets down to is, as you go on into this, with the single-use plastic straws, basically the server cannot offer somebody a straw with their drink. The customer has to request it, and it actually can lead up to, again, there's this fine of $25 for each day, not to exceed $300, but it can also include up to 6 months of jail time in there. And that can be for the server as well. So they run into hundreds to even thousands of dollars, depending on how the violations and whether it's a first or second time offense, and then it can go right into jail time. So, you know, certainly they can use straws that are not plastic, you know, they can use like paper, pasta, sugar cane straws, wood straws, bamboo straws. They can use all kinds of other types of straws, but just not the plastic ones. But the absurdity of these and the fines and the restrictions on it are just absolutely crazy. And our final absurd piece comes from Michigan, where we are looking at Gretchen Whitmer, and she's now demanding 2-year-olds wear masks. And she's basically, she's upset that the lockdowns haven't been efficient enough for her. People are not doing as much of her bidding as she would like them to do, and the science does not support or encourage having masks on kids that are ages 2 to 4 years old. And now, so she wants to drop this down, and she wants to start doing this. And again, this is insane, because a child's brain is forming during that time. There's so much stuff, and again, this is about programming. Their mind is so receptive, and this is where so much of their values, their life, their ideas, how they will move through life is formed during these years. These are some of the most critical years in a child's life. But where else do we see this happening? We see it happening in China. We see it happening under the CCP rule in particular. And so, again, it's not about the Chinese people, it's about that CCP rule, that communist structure rule that is happening and the paths that has taken, because we do have so much of that influence here happening in America in so many layers and in so many ways and through so many influences. And I talked about that again last month when I talked about the infiltration that is going on. So she wants this mandate on these young kids, and again, we just see the absurdity of this, and we see the comments of, you know, this is not okay. You know, a lot of people coming to me saying this is not okay. And what's happening with these people is when they hit these absurd points, they think because they control everything that they will never have to be worried about being voted out of office or held accountable. And they're absolutely wrong about that, because a lot of these people, we're going to see them over the next couple of years, are going to be removed from office one way or another. And when I say that, what I mean is that either they will be voted out to a point that the machines will not be able to, do it, which is why the fair elections are so important, or they will actually be charged with crimes and held accountable. So these things are coming, they're coming, and it's kind of interesting when we see these absurd stories, and that we need to pay attention to it. So I want to move on to these aspects of how hate and division is driven, and how do we get to some of these points, because this hate and this division is so driven in such subtle ways, and it starts in the most subtle ways that you don't even think about. And again, it's about triggering these reactions, these responses in you, which is, you know, the ability to master one's emotions. That doesn't mean that you don't feel things, because it is important to feel things. It is important to be aware of what is rolling through us emotionally on things. But what it comes down to is really taking a look at, realizing these tactics, because if we're going to learn and we're going to move forward and we're going to create different opportunities of a society that is not based in these things, then we have to understand how they happen and how they work. Now, in the past, they would go out and create physical wars, and you talk 100, 200, whatever, 300, 500 years ago, Christ's time, they'd go out and create these wars, and they would do things on a more physical level. Now it's, with the internet up, it's about the internet. It's about information, where they have this captive audience. They have tools and technology and things like that that they use to move these ideas through. And thought I was going to sneeze there. So let's take a look for a moment here at things in these different aspects, and I'll show you some pieces of how this comes about. But these things are driven through not just political posts or things like that, but they're driven through everything. And they'll select people or organizations or groups or things that they see as maybe having a high influence on people, and they'll start to put them under attack. They'll make them a target. And one of the ways that they do this is they will have people, and we'll see this in some of the things that I'm going to share, is they will pay people to come in and be paid commenters on posts. So they get paid whatever they get paid. They don't openly advertise for this. It's something that they bring people in that they know that they can trust, so that they're not getting, they're trying to reduce their exposure or people coming in undercover on these things. And they have clients who want to promote certain things, narratives, as the case may be, and so they hire these people to make comments to trigger reactions, to put these things out there, and it's graduated in stages where they start maybe very gentle and very quiet, and then they learn how to become more and more and more combative, how to grow that and grow more and more hate. And what happens is they understand by putting these people in here, it breaks down a person's self-worth, it generates hate, it generates argument, it generates battle. So this is one of the things. So they use any of the hot topics that they want to use. And these things all become really, again, distractions from the bigger pieces, whether we talk about race or masks or vaccines. These are all distractions from the bigger pieces that are going on. So they get everybody busy arguing and hating and being in these issues. And then they go ahead and they implement these other things, and they put these other things forward while nobody's looking. These are what we call bait pieces. And so, you know, bait in codes, for example, is really about testing whether you are going to stand in your infinite soul self, your divine self, or whether you will be allow that to be destroyed, whether you'll be led astray from that. And so bait pieces oftentimes seem like something good, and then they draw you into these battles. We see this also, another way that they do this is one of the pieces to generate these aspects of brainwashing is they need aspects of trauma. So not only through the division and the hate, but they will post things of violence, of terror, that stimulate fear, that stimulate heartache, heartbreak. And we see this, for example, in animal abuse pictures. There's people out there, and they'll go and they'll join the animal groups, and you know, they might join a group for cats, or they might join a group for dogs, or whatever. And those will be groups that will, everybody's sharing pictures of their animals and loving animals, or animals doing different things, right? But then these people start in, and then they start posting these, making these posts where you'll see the animals stitched all the way down their front. You'll see an eye removed, things like this. This is about creating trauma in people. This is about opening that portal that breaks them down to the point that when you're in trauma and you're under these conditions, or when you feel pain, you become receptible to programming. It's also connected to desensitizing people to violence. And so then what they do is they make these posts and they say, oh, give this post a like, give this an amen, give this stuff. And people do it because they're going, oh, yes, we still love you, you're still a cute little animal. And this is what they believe that they are doing on these posts. What they don't realize is the animal abuse that they're supporting by liking those posts, by commenting on those posts. And that drives certain traffic in different directions that actually go to areas that people don't even realize half the time. They just think it's an innocent post. And so I always encourage people, please stop commenting on those posts, because the horrors that are behind them and the torture that is behind them is coming from people who are absent. They're absent in connection to the soul. They're absent of empathy. They're sociopaths in this aspect, and they're willing to create this violence to further an agenda. Some of them may be paid. Some of them may just be doing it because of the sociopathic nature that they're standing in. So, you know, again, this is very important, and this hypocrisy, all of these pieces are used to reprogram people into hate. And then they start to believe that what is bad is good, just like you know, the torture of an animal is good. That's where the programming goes. And then they start to see what is actually good as being bad. Like, oh, this is bad, because they get conditioned with negative feedback that if they're supporting what's good, if I'm supporting what's about freedom, for example, and then a bunch of people attack me, you know, what they believe is that they're going to wear me down to a point that I will then decide that speaking about freedom is a bad thing. It's reprogramming the mind through stimulus response, almost through like a Pavlov type of response. And that's what these commenters and people are doing. So that eventually hits a person, and they've proven this with people that come back from war and prisoners of war in particular, that they, even with full proof right in front of their face, showing them the facts, they will still believe the lie. And this is the dangerous tipping point that we're at in our society, is we have people that even when you put the facts in the face and they hear things directly from somebody telling them, yes, indeed, we are, you know, promoting this ideology in the school systems, or yes, we are promoting propaganda and controlling these narratives. And so even with that information right in front of their face from the source, they don't believe it because of the level of brainwashing and programming that they're under. So then what they do is, after they post these types of things, or they get those comments out there, and they create this division and this hate is going on, then they get backup news for the paid commentators, and they start to bring that out and these things, and they start citing different pieces that are distorted in the citations, and then they get, you know, so it just really cascades on. When we look at the aspects of hate is literally rooted in black magic. And black magic is what? Black magic is really nothing more than a program. It's nothing more than a program that has infiltrated the brain and changed its way of thinking in many ways. Hate is about suffocating freedom. It is about creating restrictions. It is about conforming and creating conformist aspects in there, as opposed to free expression. So a lot of people think that they're operating in free expression, but they're actually then moving from hate instead of just a free expression. Violence, once it moves from hate into actual violence, now what we're getting into is, this shows, they're actually in the codes, it shows that somebody is operating under the influence of other people's suggestion to do what is not responsible and not practical and not of integrity. They are at a point when somebody is at a violent stage that they're unable to think or operate for themselves, and that is the code pattern. And it makes absolute sense when you hear that, when you listen to that, and you understand, yeah, that's exactly what's happening. By the time somebody reaches violence, they're not doing this, because you see, hate and violence are not innate in the human nature. They're not a natural part of human nature. Experiments are a big thing, and a lot of these, we've had a lot of experiments, which I'm going to get into, these human experiments, a long time. Mind control experiments and things like that is also about removing a person's ability to think for themselves. And it is really about moving people into creating an unfavorable outcome. But people don't see it this way. They don't oftentimes see these additional connections. We've had mind control experiments by the CIA through many people that people believe they should be able to trust, and that becomes even more traumatic, and then thus makes them even more programmable. One of the big things that came out in the news recently was inmates vaccine overdose. That happened in Ohio, and the first thing that hit me, I'm like, this is like human experiment stuff. And there's several points in history where inmates have been used as human experiments with vaccines, with medications, with different things. They're oftentimes subjected to these experiments. And so when people start calling for certain aspects and they start saying, you know, well, we should try to rehabilitate people, they oftentimes don't realize what's happening in these prisons. They oftentimes don't realize, and I'm all for rehabilitating because I do believe that people can shift and that they can change. And, you know, but there are times where people can and can't be rehabilitated, and we have to acknowledge in which cases those are and aren't happen. But we also have to realize that if we imprison somebody for life, as opposed to the death penalty, I'm not saying I'm pro or against the death penalty by any means, but what I'm saying is we have to also consider the enormous amount of torture that often goes on in the prison systems. And for some people, and sorry, my throat was drying out. For some people, that torture is far worse than just being killed. This is why when you get into a communist society like where the CCP is running things, that people will oftentimes commit suicide because the torture of the prison camps, the torture of going into a prison situation is worse than dying for them. So we always want to keep these things in mind. And when I look at the codes, by the way, of vaccine overdose and how that is connected, that is all about removing freedom, all about removing the ability to be self-functioning, all about, again, materialism, all about destroying spirit completely. And the vaccines that were used were the gene-modifying vaccines. They were the Pfizer vaccines in there. So let's jump in here and let's take a look, and I want to share these things. This one comes through Tibet.net, which, you know, is about restoring freedoms for Tibet. And they actually show in here that at this time, this was in 2019, so we're a couple of years down the line. I'm sure it's much greater now. 2 million internet trolls get paid to comment on social media. And, you know, here's what's behind that. And so, you know, trolling, again, it's targeting in many ways certain people, certain groups or things like that, and they go in specifically to, their purpose is to try to create discord or distract others by posting off-topic comments online. So trolls have been around for a long time. I mean, they've been around in radio shows, on different forums and things like that where people do broadcasts, like on, trying to think of the one broadcast formula that there were radio shows on, but a couple of those, and they'll go in and they'll make calls, and then they go off on these other strange tangents of things. But, you know, they're basically putting forth this specifically to create conflict. That's what they're there for. And in China, they're called, there's actually a whole group that's called the 50 Cent Brigade, and or known as the 50 Cent Army, and that's a common term there that is a group of online commentators, and they're employed by the CCP, and they are paid 50 cents for every pro-China post. So these people, there's more people that are hired, they're more active, they do more postings, say during election type times, or, you know, at times where they have certain agendas that they want to push through, or certain things that they want to put in the face. So they are there specifically to support the narrative. They are there to specifically drive certain agendas in there. And you know, when you look at these things, this has a whole interview on somebody that was a paid commenter and talk about it. So I'll make sure you have the link to that in there. And at the time, he was 26 years old. He had just graduated from university in media studies. And he was introduced through a friend, and that's how it comes about. You're always introduced usually through a friend, because then they feel like they can trust whoever is coming in, again, to do this work. And he compared to what most people know. They do not, earn just 50 cents per post, but they have to make like 100 comments before they earn that 50 cents. And so the compensation is actually quite low in there, but there's certain things when you are involved, again, that you have to give up. Remember, you have to give up certain beliefs or religious practices in order to take jobs that support the CCP. So there's a lot of different payoffs in there. He said he often received instructions via email after an incident happened, and sometimes before the news was reported, on how they should guide the netizens' thoughts to blur their focus or to fan their enthusiasm for certain ideas. So you see, they're getting the sort of intel information, and they start the narrative going before it even hits the news systems in there. That's what these commentators are. So again, opening up to create this discord. We have here from Wake Up World, which, is a kind of more of a, they deal with a lot of different issues, all different aspects of life and spirituality, environment, all kinds of different things. And these, they actually have an entire story here that is on a gentleman that was a disinformation agent, and he actually gets into explaining, he called himself a shill, a disinformation shill, which means you are promoting propaganda in there. And he got brought into it by a friend, and he talks about, how these operations work, how they set up, they go, they might not be in one place for more than a month or a few months at a time, maybe 6 months at a time. They're always disappearing, they're always changing locations, and they're always very careful about things. They don't even, they don't want to know your skills, they don't care about your skills, they just want to see if you can comply, they just want to see if you'll be able to promote the narrative that has been happening. So he runs through and shares an incredible story on here of how these paid commenters work, how they get in there, how they promote the narratives and aspects. And again, I'll put that link for you in the discussion, or in the in my information area, description area. I'm trying to blank on terms. Now we've got also this area from stuff.com. It's a New Zealand site and based in technology, and it talks about how trolls make money from their online hate speech. And so, they actually go forth this aspect, and for some people it might be a couple of $100 a day, or a couple of $100 a month. For some of them, it's several $1,000s a month. This one student spent 300 hours observing the behavior of these commentators and what happened to them in the process of doing this. And this is another piece that's important, because if they can bring these commentators in to start promoting the propaganda and these different narratives, what they actually found in this study was that they started becoming incredibly hateful people. Their whole nature was changing as a result of what they were posting and how they were posting. So trolls who were trolling in a more innocent, typical, funny ways, making fun of things, humor, things like that. Of course, not funny to some of the other people, but they could earn a little bit of money with it. But one person on Patreon, they received maybe a couple of $100 that was donated to them by his fans. So they might have a fan base that donates money to them. They might have a GoFundMe account or Patreon account or something like that set up where people can donate, and people that are following the narrative then support them, and then they look for that that person's narratives, and that they support them to keep posting those narratives in there. Companies that hire trolls would be prepared, for actually paying them. That might be small businesses, or it could be big corporations, or it could be, could be the Bill Gates that are paying somebody to pay somebody to pay somebody in there, and the chain goes on because they want to keep their name clear in that. So they have, again, these organizations that pop up and down at a moment's notice, and they kind of look at it and they tell these people, well, it's just about marketing, and it's not just about marketing. When you cross the line of becoming hate, when you cross the line of attacking people, it's not just about marketing. It's about brainwashing. It's about these other tactics that are in place. So these things can turn, and we've seen them. As somebody becomes more and more involved in that hate mindset in there, they actually then will start to turn more into the violence and the threats, and that's where it gets even more and more dangerous. And of course, threats made during research, this whole study, I kind of encourage you to follow it because, again, one of these trolls, for instance, had 500,000 subscribers on Reddit and almost 100,000 followers on Facebook and Twitter. And so again, these are true fans, and they get the trolls to to just keep making to be provocative in what they're posting, to again trigger people, to trigger different responses in people. And this is exactly as I mentioned, what the CCP does. And they say these provocative things to maybe shock you. Some of them will actually threaten you. Most of that happens in initial phases when they're trying to when they haven't built up a certain amount of trust yet, and things, and that's how they start to get them to change the narratives in this. Their findings suggest that a troll first selects a medium that's amenable to trolling. So here again, we've got all of these world issues, right? Masks, vaccines, climate crisis, all these different things. So they find a medium to work from. And one thing that makes some places very friendly to trolling is the absence of regulators or the presence of incapable regulators, or regulators that are supporting the narrative of the troll or what the troll is doing. So, if the troll wants to trigger people, they might go through Facebook because they know that they're not going to be punished by Facebook or Twitter for different things because they're supporting those same narratives, and they're operating under the same influences. And then they start looking for targets, so people who might be a little bit vulnerable, people who are maybe not completely secure in their selves, and we don't always know how it's going to be affecting. And that goes on to some do it because they've got an agenda or an opinion that's contrary to something that's popular. Some do it because they're angry and they're spiteful, and some do it just for kicks. So there's all different types of motivations with these trolls in there. And what they find is that they're very effective. People will, targets have been reported to quit a particular service after being trolled enough. After they've been targeted enough, they just go away. They force them to go away. And why would they want that to do it? Because if you could force somebody who's telling the truth, who's speaking about compassion, who's trying to bring people together in harmony away, you now remove that influence, which means you have greater control over the larger audience. So definitely worth taking an aspect. And they don't really, it's interesting because they don't see trolling as cyberbullying. They don't see it as the same thing. So anyways, I'll put that link in the description for you, and you can look more through it. There's a little video of somebody on there as well talking about it. This post here, quick aspect, is done by an individual, and she actually talks about what's behind when you type the amen for a baby and share. You don't realize if you're being heartless in that situation, and you don't realize that a lot of those photos might be stolen from somebody, and she actually goes in to explain it and talk about how people are being exploited, how the images are used to exploit things. So you might have people that are just trying to scam people for money, and they'll go in and they'll use a picture that maybe somebody has posted that was truly traumatic for them, that was truly a odd situation. They'll take somebody else's trauma, they'll post that picture, and then encourage people to donate to them. It's twisted. It's very, very twisted, and it's very deceitful in there. And again, you don't think about it. And she talks, when it comes to posts like this, one share does not equal one prayer. And she wanted to emphasize that it does not. And one like does not mean that you think the baby with a physical disability or the animal that's been abused or is different is still cute. One comment does not mean the sick child or abused puppy will be saved. It doesn't mean that at all. So she really brings in this awareness of what's happening in these things, and talks about why people steal them and use these images of sick babies or suffering creatures without permission, because it's about a scam. It's about a scam. This is an example that was in Consumer Affairs that she cites in here. Since Facebook's algorithms place a high value on popularity, as measured by likes and shares, these highly liked and shared pages therefore have a much higher chance of appearing in people's feeds. Okay, so if you've got an agenda to traumatize people, to desensitize them to violence and harm and things like this, then you need to have that showing highly in people's feeds. You need to have a reach exposure. So they ask for the amens and the likes to get that exposure to more people for less effort. Then once the page is sufficiently a high popularity rating, like the like farmer either removes the page's original content and replaces it with something else. This is oftentimes malware or scam advertising, and then leaves the page as is and uses it as a platform for continued what they call farming of information on there. And it's collecting people's marketing information or engaging in other harmful activities, or they outright sell the highly liked site to cyber criminals. So it's a massive scam. It's a massive financial piece for them. It has nothing to do, again, with caring about animals. Best for Pets actually put this out in a similar way, realizing that not all of these things are legitimate sites. Many are simply clickbait to get people to their website and to other advertising. So it's actually, very, very destructive. And they go into talking about how animal lovers, for example, and people who really do want to rescue and stuff, how you can follow up and tell if something is legitimate or it's not legitimate in there. So definitely a big piece to look at. Psychology Today actually brings out this whole article on, is there a link between sociopathy and social media, and how, really the sociopaths thrive on social media. I mean, that's a great area for them to get their craziness across in things, and they get into these aspects of how these antics, they start off with a simple thing of maybe posting something on Facebook or saying they're going to do something, and then it grows and it grows and it grows. And they've cited an example of a couple of young guys from Ohio, Columbus, Ohio, that started live streaming their antics on a social media app, Periscope, and then they started engaging people as far as, well, if you want to see us do this, do the likes or whatever it is, the aspect is. and they started playing out more and more and more things, and how this actually perpetuates into oftentimes killing, and they thrive off of the attention. They thrive off of what they're getting from people going, yeah, 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 go beat somebody up. And, you know, so here again, it's this whole perpetuation of violence, of hate, of aspects. And so people that already have these tendencies or maybe have these programs like I talked about in part one, connected to the MLK, can be released, and they start to thrive, and it can trigger some of these things to show up. So definitely an aspect of there that it's about attention getting. It's about narcissistic behavior. It's about the sociopathic behavior. And again, you can read a whole lot more on this on the Psychology Today article. Now, continuing to move on, we want to talk about the psychology of fear and what's going on. Also from Psychology Today, you know, they get into this aspect of the role of fear. You know, why do we hate? What is behind the hate that comes up in things? And there can be a lot of different reasons in there, and they talk about that in this article, the fear of the other, as they like to put it. And what this is that we fear things that are different from us. And I think that that has been a really big role in the last year of people being driven into this division and this hate as a result of fearing that perhaps what somebody else is saying could be true. What if what we've always been told was a conspiracy was actually true? What if it is a conspiracy, but it's not a conspiracy theory that is fiction, but actually something that's playing out? And so that is one of the areas that drives this hate, is this fear. We know that hatred is driven by two key emotions, love and aggression. One, love for the in-group. In other words, people will hate because they fear being left out of being the popular group or going along with the crowd. So they have a love for being a part of the crowd to the point that they will do things that are not good, that are hateful, that are hurtful, that are damaging, just because they don't want to be left out, just because they're not strong enough and comfortable enough in their own self to make their own decisions. So again, that persuasiveness, remember I talked about that in the code influence, of that influence by other people. And the other part is aggression for, or hate for the out-group, so the ones that are being isolated out. So for example, the truthers, or people that might be getting isolated out, the non-mask wearers, the people who don't want to get a vaccine. Well, you're going to be excluded from all of these things. Okay, so that makes them an out-group. Okay, and so they then maybe get angry because people are not willing to follow what they want to have done, or they don't like that this group of people, what happens is they're posed as being a threat to the in-group. This has happened. This is exactly how the CCP works, and this is exactly what people like Maxine Waters and Lori Lightfoot and these other mayors have created. Gretchen Whitmer, that anybody who does not support their little clique, who doesn't support their corruption, is a threat to the in-group. And that's what I was talking about in the beginning of what the whole virus was about. Then we have this aspect of fear of ourselves. Okay, so the things that people hate about others are the things that they fear in themselves. So if you have somebody who's strong, who can stand up to a group, who can think for themselves, okay, then the hate starts to be driven because they fear that they can't be that strong as that person who's standing up to the group, who's willing to be on the outside, who's willing to say, no, I'm not going to do this because it doesn't support any facts, because it's not rooted in what's healthy for me, and things like that. And so that then starts to make the person a target. You know, it starts to make them a target because it's then they start to do this projection. Like, I know that, you know, even if they're doing the wrong thing, they'll say, I'm not terrible, you're terrible, okay? And you're terrible because because you trigger a fear in me. So this is the projection aspect, and it's a survival aspect, again, and we see this a lot like in China with the CCP, where people will go into this mentality of projection strictly to survive because they don't want to go through beatings, because they don't want to be exposed to violence, because they want to have a certain lifestyle or things like that. So they don't want to be rejected and they don't want to be alone. So they make this projection that what is good is bad and that what is bad that they're supporting is good. It's that twisting, and we have a lot of that in our society. There's a lack of self-compassion that goes on. That's another big piece in there. It means that we accept the whole self if we're standing in self-compassion. And if we find part of ourselves unacceptable, then we tend to attack others in order to defend against what we're not feeling acceptable within ourselves. If we're okay with ourselves, we see others' behaviors as about them and can respond with compassion. If I kept hate in my heart for another person, I would have to hate myself as well. So it is only when we learn to hold ourselves in that compassion that we can start to let go of the hate. It also fills a void for some people. This is another piece in there. They believe that when hate involves, participation in a group, and so hatred of individuals or groups is a way of distracting again from what they're doing. So when these people are out there provoking the hate and they're saying, hey, those people did it, that group did it, blah, 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 then, they're distracting attention away. And this can create anxiety. They may have a hard time creating their own identity in things, so they don't want people looking at them. Their attempt to distract from what they're feeling, their aspects of helplessness, their aspects of powerlessness, where they believe there's an injustice or inadequacy or where they're ashamed. So you get these corrupt people in high positions and they're ashamed of what they're doing, and then they, again, project hate out onto somebody else just so that people won't pay attention to what we're doing. Pelosi actually does this a lot in there, and we have many, many people in the political arena that do this. So they perceive things as a threat that aren't a threat. AOC does this a lot. It's an attitude that then gives rise to this hostility and this aggression towards people or groups. And so it just keeps cascading on. Then you have the societal and cultural effects as to why we hate in there. And this is part of a psychological makeup, a family history, but it's also in cultural and political history. And we kind of live in this war culture which promotes violence. And we're very much in that now, much more than we were, even a couple of decades ago. And so competition becomes this way of life. And so we fear connecting with other people because it requires us to reveal something about ourselves. And then we're taught to hate the enemy, whatever the enemy is, and that could vary, depending on where you're sitting and things or your perspective and things. And basically the enemy is anybody that's different from us. And so these little room for vulnerability and an exploration of hate through empathic discourse and understanding. So, it doesn't allow us to really resolve these aspects in there. And so people become more ready to fight instead of resolve conflict in this option. And when we start bringing it into the societal and the cultural factors, peace is hardly ever the option because they're just bred into this war mentality. And hatred is learned. This is the thing. Hatred is not something we're born with. It's something that we're learned. And we are born with the capacity for aggression, but we're also born with the capacity for compassion. And it all depends on where we put our energy, and that's a big, big key in this, is where are we putting our energy? Now, when we look at some of these things, and hate shifts into violence. Hate is kind of the first layer before violence unfolds in things. And this site is 9commentaries.com, which actually addresses, and I do use the CCP as an example a lot, because they're a great example of how these things have come about over time and how they've unfolded, and it shows how the escalation happens in there. And so there was a point where one of the points was a massacre in northern China during the war against Japan. And they would do things here to where they used violence, the CCP, when I say they used violence, to terrify people into submission. And this is what's happening. And so as you desensitize people to violence, they stop seeing violence as a bad thing. As they stop seeing violence as a bad thing, then it becomes easier and easier to get them into submission to what you want, and to get them to cross the line from accepting it or seeing it to doing it. And so this is a programming that they're instilling all the way along the way. So, they had, for example, where they brought children into a square from school, and the purpose for the gathering was specifically to watch the killing of patriotic people, young men in this particular case. 13 was the number they used, they had fabricated charges against. There weren't even actual charges against them. They just made it up. They brought them in there, and they did this killing of them to specifically show this is what's going to happen if you go against our narrative. If you go against what we want you to do, this is what's going to happen. And then they were forced to sing the songs to support the CCP, to support the party, and and they tried to make it like a performance, but it was not really dancers, but they were executioners that were holding a knife in their hands. And this is the way that they work, and we don't like to think about these things because we don't want to believe that we're moving in that direction. But we still have that opportunity to change things. So it became very violent. It became very graphic in there, and this made the children hysterical. It turned into more of the screaming and this crying, and really the impact again that we have, and this is why they try to impact the children, to do it early on so that they can program them and remove these resistances. And they tried to keep the songs going, the teacher's trying to do this because it's a survival mode, in a sense she believes she's trying to keep them safe. And, this whole point of how they bring this out, and, once they get to a point where they desensitize people to a certain point, they have to keep making it more and more and more horrifying. And when it's not horrifying or exciting enough, then they start inventing all kinds of cruel tortures, which can be, they've had instances of boiling people alive, things like this. They will get kids to beat their parents, literally to death at times. And they would put them through swallowing large amounts of salt or other things of embarrassment, rolling around on broken glass and throwing them into frozen rivers. And so it becomes more and more increased. And what they do is about every so many years, they do a massive display of violence and terror tactics just to hold people into this fear, because they know it's only going to last so long. And so I can put that on there for those that want to read more about that and that want to see more about what's happening there. Now, this aspect you heard me mention early on, that the inmates were given this COVID-19 vaccine overdose. And, you know, this is one of those things that if we didn't have such a history of experimentation on prison people, it'd be a different story, but we do. And so I really struggle with this. But, you know, first of all, this caught my attention. 77 inmates. 77 inmates. Right there, that's kind of an auspicious thing, because that is sort of a battle energy in many ways. That is also a claim to indicate or to signal a certain amount of success, or success in a certain type of thing, a certain agenda, a certain aspect playing out. It is being one-sided. It is supporting a particular point of view. That's the code perspective of that 77 energy. So we actually have to be very careful of that. But they were given overdoses, and they were given 6 times, actually, the recommended dose of what they should have gotten in the penitentiary. Many of them experienced what they considered reasonably mild symptoms. They're being monitored. But this is where the experiments happen. And the reality of it is we've had many, many prison inmate experiences go on in our history. And, you know, in this case, mostly they said, well, there's sore arm, body aches. No inmate has experienced a low-grade, and one inmate experienced a low-grade fever, which was treatable with Tylenol. They said no inmates have been hospitalized. But here's the thing. We are a human experimentation. The human race is being experimented on, and most experiments are happening without telling anybody. And that's kind of where this just waved this big flag, like, you have so many recorded, structured pieces in a prison system that you might accidentally overdose 1 patient or 2 patients. But when you overdose 77, I mean, that's a really particular number. That's not even a 75 or 100. I mean, that's a really particular number that you're putting out there. And this has been all over the mainstream media sources, which is another sign that tells me there's a narrative behind this. There's an absolute narrative behind it, because it is reported by all of them. And it was the Pfizer vaccine, which is the mRNA vaccine, one of them. And so it really is just, and who do they reach out to? The CDC. This is just all so many flags for me. It's like they want the CDC to know what they did, and not because they care about the inmates or that they're concerned about what they gave them. But this, again, is a notification. This is an experiment. This is saying, okay, this has been done, and now we need to watch it. So lots of links are going to be in the things. And let's just take a look at some of the basic pieces about the vaccine, okay? I mean, you might get a little bit extra. I mean, nobody's 100% precise, right, when they're doing vaccines. But most people who are trained to give a vaccine understand exactly the portions, and they tend to be very, very careful of things. But let's take a look here at just a couple of pieces. So you've got a vial, and that vial has, once you dilute it down, it's got 6 doses worth. That means they would have had to give, and entire vial, this is why they oftentimes will vaccinate so many people at a time, because they've got to use that vial up within a certain period of time. Now, I want to forward up to another point in this video where they show you the administration. So you see how little of the liquid part was in the shot that was given. And so when you're talking 6 times that dose, that means that they would have had to fill that entire syringe up. And if you're giving that many shots, you definitely know whether you've filled the entire syringe or whether you're just taking 300 milliliters, which is just a small part of the syringe in there. And those people that think, oh, no, people don't, they don't actually do these experiments. That doesn't happen. Our people would never do that to each other. Well, absolutely they do. History.com is one of the areas that actually talks specifically about the CIA's appalling human experiments with mind control. And it is about mind control because, you see, when they can get into the mind and create the programming, they can completely control somebody. And what's happening now is, as I'm going to show over the next pieces of information, is that they can take total control. When they start to combine a substance, whether that happens through a vaccine or whether that happens through a drug of any sort. Of course, vaccines are a great way to put a drug into a body, or they alter a gene or any of these things. And it can work in coordination with other things, such as radio waves. And I will also be showing you these aspects of different radio waves that can work with microchips. And this has been around for decades and decades and decades, and how they can fully control somebody, and they literally have no control over their body on this. So when we get to this, let's take a look at this a little bit. CIA experiments that were going on. This on April 10th, 1953, Allen Dulles, he was a big one that was the director of the CIA at that time, and he got very, very fascinated with this aspect that American POWs returning from the country may have been from the Korean War, from Korea, may have been converted, so-called converted, by communist brainwashers, and that some of them were confessing to war crimes, carrying out germ warfare. So we're talking all the way back, 70 years ago almost, in time that they've been doing this. This is not a new thing. This is not something that's just coming to the surface. They were reportedly so brainwashed they had even refused to return to the United States. And if that wasn't enough, the U.S. was weeks away from secretly sponsoring the overthrow of a democratically elected leader in Iran. You see how these countries keep coming back around, like we're dealing with Iran now. And he had become the first civilian director of an agency growing more powerful. So this was at the time that the CIA's power was growing and growing and growing, and it was growing through some really, really corrupt people. And they had become accustomed to hearing a lot about the battle for men's minds, which is called the War of Ideologies. And see, this is all kind of resurfacing again. And he told attendees of the speech he was giving, I wonder, however, whether we clearly perceive the magnitude of the problem, whether we realize how sinister the battle for men's minds has become. And at that time he said, in Soviet hands, he continued, we might call it in its new form, brain warfare. Brain warfare. So this is exactly what we've been seeing playing out. We just have had it on such subtle levels for so long. And he gestured to the American POWs returning from Korea that they were just shells of what they used to be. They were empty. They were just parroting the communist propaganda that they had heard for weeks and weeks on end. And he said he expressed fears and uncertainty where they were using chemical agents. So again, this chemical agents with the verbal programming, with the abuse and the violence that they go through, and then it locks somebody into these programs. And you know, he says, really in the West, we're not really as versed in brain warfare as these Eastern societies are in there. And he's, you know, commented that, you know, really this would be kind of unethical to do in many ways, but the fear of brainwashing, this brain warfare, just, you know, really fascinated them throughout the 1950s, and it got spurred on with the CIA's stories of these brainwashed GIs that were returning, and what that could happen, and how that worked versus Western psychology or psychiatry in there. And the accounts, it offered new potentials for mind control techniques and technology that no man could fully resist. And this is where some of the paranoia started to come out. We saw things with books like The Manchurian Candidate became a big thing. The Naked Lunch was another big thing. Again, they kind of wrote these off as conspiracies, but the fact is these things actually happened. You know, maybe there's, I don't know, I haven't read those particular books, but so I can't really speak to them. But you know, this aspect of brainwashing, not just the enemy, but their own people were going on. And, you know, they looked at this, you know, in some ways trying to find explanations, in some ways trying to see how they could implement it. And they said, you know, why else would many countries be embracing such an obviously backward ideology? And this is where we're at. The only reason you would embrace a backward ideology that is destructive to humans and that removes their spiritual essence is because they're under this mind control. They're under this current. And they go on to talk about CIA, you know, or operations that went down, which was MK Ultra was one of them, where they did a lot of experiments with LSD. And this gets into why we have so many drugs and why so many of the people that are involved in these things promote the drug running, that promote the narcotics coming in. This is where a lot of the opium crisis originated from, was decades ago when they were implementing these things and doing these experiments, because if they can get people hooked onto drugs, they're easier to program. They're easier to control them. They're easier to make them susceptible to this. There was Operation Midnight Climax, which was another big one that they came out that they were operating in, and I think it was San Francisco, and that just really was involved some really rough LSD experiences, prostitutes, the whole work in there, and then, you know, eventually what they did was they tried to cover up the MK Ultra, and that's one of the things that they do try to do in these different agendas. Even on Wikipedia, you can go in and you can see simply by looking at unethical human experimentation in the United States, and they'll list many things throughout history: surgical experiments, pathogens, disease, and biological warfare, which was mostly starting to come up in the 19th and the 20th century, and it coordinated right at the time of heavy communism coming out. These things have coordinated, like the mass thing, coordinating with Hitler's times in there. And it gets into, you know, just ones that have happened throughout the years. Human radiation experiments that went on and different things where you can check those out, chemical experiences that went on and different programs in that, and you can just see the things that they put people through that were really these torture experiments. And most of these people that they did these projects on, these truth serum projects, Project Chatter, which was, the U.S. Navy was involved in, Project Bluebird, Project Artichoke, all of these things, which involved using psychoactive substances, including LSD, heroin, marijuana, cocaine. So why are they trying to legalize these drugs? Okay, it's because of this programming. It's because it's about experimentation. They are using the human race as an experimentation. They are using us to experiment with these different things. They have no concern about people. It's really not about whether somebody smokes marijuana or not. It's about whether they can get them to control, because they know if they can get these drugs into their hands and they can get them doing these things, that they will be able to control them. And so it goes on and on into those different things. And of course, MK Ultra was happening until about 1973, and then they shut it down, and they actually erased a lot of the information, or got rid of a lot of the information around it, because they didn't want it coming to the surface. They didn't want to experiment, or to see people have people see what they had actually done. Huge amounts of money thrown into these things. We have really some of the most disturbing experiments that have been done, and again, they oftentimes come around to understanding. They disguise them as trying to understand people's psyches, or we're trying to find an antidote to something, or we want to see how this works. And you can go through here and see this one has 31. So this one talks about prison inmates as test subjects, and Kilgman was the big person in the 50s who did a lot of inmate studies and started experimenting on them, and what would happen. And again, they just saw these people pretty much as expendable in there. People that went in for medical care, and then they had things that were done. Henrietta Lacks, she was one of the people that they pulled things from and started working with cloning of her cells. And she was an African-American woman. You want to talk about some of the real crimes against racists? It's in these agendas. It's not about race, but it's using people for experimentation. We have to get back to this bigger collective. QK Hilltop, Stateville Penitentiary malaria studies. These things are crazy, and they have been going on and on and on. Electroshock therapy on children, Project Artichoke, hepatitis in mentally disabled children that they did experiments on, Operation Midnight Climax, study of humans accidentally exposed to fallout radiation. Well, we know a lot of these things weren't just accidental, they were created. The monster study in things, and some of these things, again, they get into it, and I'll put the links in where you can go through them. They show and they explain where even once people were presented with the truth, they stayed with the lie in them. They may have retained that programming for the rest of their life, like using this particular one here. The monster study was with children, where they gave one group all positive speech and one group all negative speech, and the ones that received the negative speech, and they were belittled for every little thing. They grew up maintaining speech impediments. They grew up maintaining these aspects of different things. Experimentations that happened on newborns, the Aversion Project in there, and it just, again, more medical experiments on prison inmates, sexual reassignment, and how this actually affected somebody for the rest of their life, and they were actually sexually reassigned to a sex that they didn't even associate with, and how that created all kinds of issues for them that eventually led to suicide. radiation of testicles, Stanford prison experiments, syphilis experiments. So you see these things that they try to perpetuate as a virus that just originally opens. They actually released these things, and it talked about these experiments that were done. They didn't just randomly show up in society. So infected mosquitoes, we know that that's one that we've heard about with Gates being involved, where he's going to release mosquitoes again. And that's probably, we're going to see a lot of things that are repeating right now from the eras of the 1950s. And there's one other aspect of the Nazi human experiments, where they would do things of, shooting people just to see how they would, how their blood would coagulate. Sulfur experiments that they did on people, that freezing and hypothermia experiments, and bomb experiments, what they call seawater experiments in here, and how that might be, how that created different types of suffering. Experiments with poisons, to get them odorless and tasteless, and this is where a lot of the big break drugs came from. Sterilization experiments, all of these things that they just thought were okay to do to people without even telling them, and how this was tied to other agendas. So that can be good to see where some of these things got tied to agendas. Now, one of the big people in the experiment industry, and we're almost through this information here, was Jose Delgado. This is just a 1-minute video, and he was known for his implantation of a chip into the brain of a bull that was used for bullfighting, and shows how he was able to completely, through his own little box, control the physical movement of the bull to stop it midstream from charging, and completely control its body through the waves and the programming of the chip. And I say this because microchips are being implemented. They are coming about today, and we need to realize that, yes, indeed, we actually can be controlled through these microchip technologies. So you can actually see in that he had a remote device in his hand to control the actions in there. So absolutely huge piece in here. And it's amazing. It's amazing how it works. He actually got out of the experiments because he was at a point he saw them being taken in an incorrect way. He originally was creating this technology to help people with anxiety, to actually be of benefit. And when he saw that people like the CIA and other groups, they wanted to attach on to this because he came and he studied in the States and worked in the States for a while, and they wanted to use this technology in less favorable ways, that's when he pulled out of it in there. Now, we do have Nick Biggich. He really was a person that also got into explaining how the transmissions of electromagnetic frequencies affected things. And I'll share a little bit of this. I know that we're way over in time in many ways. I'm going to stop it there, and I will put the link in the description for you so that you can listen to the whole thing, which is really good. But this is the importance. If they use electromagnetic frequencies to generate fear, to generate this different brainwave pattern, if they're using that in combination with other things, and let's say they know that at least 50% of the population smokes marijuana or something like that, and then they combine it with the brainwave technologies or the electromagnetic frequencies that come through, for example, a cell phone, a computer, and so on and so forth. And that when you go into fear, you cannot connect with the other aspects. This is why the brainwashing techniques and these other manipulative techniques that we talked about focus so much on driving people into fear and hate, because they cannot access the true aspects of their human potential and capabilities in that, and it leaves them defenseless. It leaves them absolutely defenseless. Now, the last thing that I want to look at here for this segment is brainwashing signs, and realizing this, because I think that this can be very valuable. This term was actually first coined in the 50s during the Korean War, and it was used to explain how totalitarian regimes were able to completely indoctrinate our American soldiers through a process of torture and propaganda. And the theory is that a person's core beliefs, ideas, affiliations, and values can be replaced, so much so that they have no autonomy over themselves and they cannot think critically or independently, which is what the doctor was just talking about in that video. And they talk about, who is likely to be brainwashed. Well, that's going to be the people who are vulnerable in some way, which means the people who have been through trauma, who are under a lot of stress. Maybe they've recently lost somebody in their life that has passed away, or they've gone through divorce, or they've just recently been let go of at their job, or they've been forced to live on the streets, or they're suffering from an illness that's hard for them to accept. So that anybody that's in this vulnerable state, this high stress state, becomes an ideal person for being brainwashed. And he talks about how can you be brainwashed. Well, you can be brainwashed. There's 5 key steps, which is isolation, attacks on the self-esteem, an us versus them mentality, blind obedience, and testing. And this is exactly what we've been seeing play out with this pandemic situation. Isolate everybody, then get them fighting, getting them arguing, getting them in this us versus them mentality, attacking their self-esteem through these different narratives. And then that breaks them down to this point where they just start blindly following, right? People stopped even questioning. They just started blindly putting on masks and things like that without even thinking, hey, I'm in an area and I'm not even around anybody and I don't need one. And this is where then the experiments and the testing start to fall in. And they break it down, actually, all of these steps of more about how that plays out in the blind obedience aspect states. And part of the blind obedience, they'll use phrases over and over again, like we saw with the George Floyd incidences and the Makia incidences and things like that, where they chant things over and over again. That is part of the brainwashing. That is part of the blind obedience that they're bringing forth in there. And when we get into the testing phase, it's not just, you know, this fiction or the past. It's real, it's present, it's in a lot of different forms of our society. And, you know, the things that we can do in all of this is to keep in mind that this is very real and it is very present, but we don't need to live in fear of it. What we want to do is to don't believe everything that you read. When you start seeing these narratives come out and you see something being hyped up, don't believe it all, because it's a narrative. It's not necessarily, it's there to get your mind thinking in a certain way. It's hijacking your mind is basically what it's doing. Don't buy into fear or scare tactics. Watch for people's agendas. Watch for the agendas. Watch for the subliminal messages that are there. Follow your own path. Don't do something just because somebody says you should do it. Do your own research. Listen to your own intuition. Do things that are meditative or things like that that keep you connected and out of these vulnerable spaces. Don't follow the crowd. Don't feel that obligation to follow the crowd, especially if you sense something isn't right. And don't be afraid to be different. And these are all the ways that we can stop some of the programming that is in there. And so I know this has been a lot of information to take in, a lot of what's out there and being out there. And I certainly hope that you'll give me some feedback, make your comments, share what you want to share, give me your thoughts on things. Again, as always, if you've got some topics that you want me to take a look at, I'll find a way to see what I can do to take a look at them. And I will be coming back at you with part 3. Don't forget to like things, share this. Who knows who this might be valuable for out there for you. And I just hope that you'll come, you know, right on back into, you know, staying with these things and learning and going through these processes, because we need to be aware. If we don't bring these things out, we can't be aware of what's happening. If we're not aware of what's happening, then we can't change the course of our future. So it all starts here, and this awareness, even if we don't like some of the things that we're seeing, it does open us up to be able to handle things. So I appreciate your time. I'll be back with part 3, which hopefully will not be that long, and definitely not as long as the first 2 parts on this. Give me a like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so, and that way you can make sure also click the little bell or whatever, you can get the notices and the messages when a new video comes out. Take care, everybody. I'll see you in part 3.